I now look to Natalie Perera to continue the case for the proposition.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak this evening. Most of all, thank you to Bill for helping with our team this evening. Look, I realise that expecting to win an argument against Oxbridge, standing here in wonderful Oxford University, is somewhat of a challenge. But I like a challenge, and I think that I can convince you to support today's motion by making 3 evidence-based points, which will prove that Oxbridge is indeed failing Britain. Now, before I make those points, I want to make 2 things very clear. First, I know that Oxbridge is just one part of our education system. Early years, schools, and post-16 provision all have a fundamental role to play in how well we serve our disadvantaged young people. Indeed, all our young people. But as leaders of higher education, as a globally recognised and esteemed establishment, Oxbridge has a moral and societal duty to fulfil, and I'll come on to how it's not currently fulfilling that duty. Second, what I'm about to say is a critique of the system, not individuals, and I'm sure all of the students sat in front of me today have worked very hard to be here. So I'm not seeking to undermine your efforts and your hard work. Rather, what I'm seeking to demonstrate is how Oxbridge is failing many other young people who are not here, and therefore how it's failing the country as a whole. So the first reason that Oxbridge is failing Britain is quite simply that it remains elitist. Around 60% of pupils in Oxbridge come from the state sector, and that compares with 90% in the wider higher education sector. And having high entry standards is no excuse. Before we even get to contextualised data, even when we control for the range of courses on offer here, for the high entry standards, Oxbridge still underperforms its benchmark by 10 percentage points. Oxford and Cambridge also have amongst the lowest proportion of students from low participation neighbourhoods. Around 3% of students in Oxbridge come from those neighbourhoods. And again, even when you control for high entry standards, Oxbridge's performance is still poor. Both universities have over a third fewer students from those neighbourhoods than their benchmarks suggest that they should. In contrast, the London School of Economics, despite also having high entry requirements, has a slightly higher proportion of students from low participant neighbourhoods than its benchmark. So this isn't unsolvable. But as we've heard, the situation is improving for some students, and that is those from the top 2 socio-economic backgrounds.
Point of information, Natalie.
Oh, go on, Lewis. I feel sorry for you.
Thank you, Natalie. Over the last 10 years, the numbers of state school students at Cambridge University has increased from about 50% to almost 65%. So do you think the trend is positive or negative for schools from the state sector?
So the proportion might have increased, but as we've heard, the proportion of offers from the top 2 wealthiest bands of background has also increased. So I'll carry on. So exactly the point I'm making. So the data released last year found that over 80% of offers from Oxbridge were made to students from the top 2 socio-economic classes, and that is a slight increase compared with 5 years earlier. So whichever way you look at it, the representation of low-income students is still derisory in Oxbridge, and that's not a matter of debate, that is a matter of fact. Now, my second point is that Oxbridge isn't doing enough to address this. Let me leave this with you. £13 million. That's how much Oxford University plans to spend on outreach and bursaries this year. Admittedly, both Oxford and Cambridge are amongst the highest spenders in this area in absolute terms. But let's put that into context. Oxford's overall endowment, not the money it raises through the fees it gets from all of you, just the money it's endowed and given, was over £5.5 billion in 2017. So that £13 million works out to under 0.25% of Oxford's total endowment. 0.25%. Now, I cannot be convinced that Oxford prioritises access when it spends the equivalent of 0.25% alone on outreach and support. Both Oxford and Cambridge have larger endowments than any other university in the UK by miles, yet they have amongst the worst rates of access. It's not just a question of money, however, it's a question of motivation and commitment. As we heard from Megan, we've had some of the brightest, you have some of the brightest minds here in Oxford. It's an intellectual powerhouse. It's a place that has produced Tim Berners-Lee, Clement Attlee, Stephen Hawking, Indira Gandhi, amongst so many notable others. Minds that created the NHS, the World Wide Web, a brief history of time, and I could go on. How can you not fix this? I truly struggle to believe how, with all the great minds contained here, you cannot fix getting more disadvantaged young people into this place. My third and final point is about why the inequity matters. Of course, there's a strong social justice argument here. Why should some pupils who are equally bright and equally aspirational miss out because they live in the wrong postcode? That's not a feature of a progressive society. But there are also deep implications for how well the country is run. Despite Oxbridge alumni making up less than 1% of the total UK population, they account for over 3/4 of barristers, over half of solicitors, journalists, senior civil servants, and almost half of the cabinet. These highly influential positions in the courtroom, the media, Whitehall, are filled with people who have no idea of the day-to-day lives, though they mean well, but they've no idea of the day-to-day lives of disadvantaged young people up and down the country. Again, and Bill will know, when we worked in the civil service, I did too, one of the things I struggled with was listening to people talk about issues like poverty, youth crime, low attainment, when they had never really lived or breathed any of these. And it really matters. Making policy and passing new laws require a deep understanding of society and the diversity of people within it. And whether we like it or not, unconscious bias seeps into the system, especially when that system is so homogenous. A while ago, I was invited as executive director of my organisation to a discussion with other think tanks. I went and hung up my coat in the cloakroom. As I walked out, 2 middle-aged white men came to hand me their coat. They thought I was the cloakroom attendant. And that still hurts today because they made an assumption that I wasn't on par with them, and it should anger each of you in this room. So for as long as the top jobs are filled overwhelmingly by Oxbridge graduates, who are in turn overwhelmingly from affluent backgrounds, the cycle of poverty and low attainment perpetuates through the system and through generations. So you should vote with the motion because, as I've demonstrated through hard data and facts, Oxbridge is failing to recruit enough young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, even when they have reached the required academic standard. It's failing to make a committed and concerted effort to address this. And the ultimate test of how well an institution serves the hardest to reach and most vulnerable society, well, the hardest test is how well it serves those people. And on this measure, I truly believe that Oxbridge can and must do better. Thank you.